try.
Good evening. It's not often you get like applause before you speak.
Happens all the time.
It is an incredible delight and honor to introduce Hisham Matar to talk about his most recent book. The book is entitled My Friends, and I think it's useful to sort of do an act of disclosure before we start, which is to say that Hisham is in fact my dearest friend. And so there's going to be a lot of sort of meta stuff happening in this conversation that you're going to have to...
We don't usually talk like this.
No, we don't. Definitely not. And so one of the things you'll discover is that friendships are really very transactional. And so you're going to try and figure out like what's going on here and who owes who what and, you know, who's obliged to who in this particular moment. So I'm going to try and help set the scene by saying Hisham's first book, he was an architect and a poet and a playwright and an actor, was shortlisted for the Booker Prize. So that doesn't happen very often. He's won the Pulitzer Prize. He's won more prizes you can imagine, an honorary doctorate for the Sorbonne. So I'm really here helping him out, as you can imagine, not. And it's been really just like a remarkable thing to be able to see such an extraordinary moment of a person who has global recognition come into the space, which is my club, and to speak. So I'm just more thrilled than ever. And he's going to start by reading.
Thank you. Hello, good evening, everyone. Hope you're well. I'm going to start from the beginning of the book, which unusually for me is really the beginning of the book. It's the first thing that I wrote, in other words. Stand up, just, you know, not as a gesture of dominance, but as I'm not threatening you. It's more out of respect, really. It is, of course, impossible to be certain of what is contained in anyone's chest, least of all one's own, or those we know well, perhaps especially those we know best. But as I stand here on the upper level of King's Cross Station, from where I can monitor my old friend Hosam walking across the concourse, I feel I'm seeing right into him, perceiving him more accurately than ever before, as though all along during the 2 decades that we have known one another, our friendship has been a study. And now, ironically, just after we have bid one another farewell, his portrait is finally coming into view. And perhaps this is the natural way of things, that when a friendship comes to an inexplicable end, or wanes, or simply dissolves into nothing, the change we experience at that moment seems inevitable. A destiny that was all along approaching, like someone walking towards us from a great distance, recognizable only when it is too late to turn away. No one has ever been a nearer neighbor to my heart. I'm convinced, as I watch him go to his train for Paris, that city where the two of us first met so long ago and in the most unlikely way, that he is carrying, right where the rib cages meet, an invisible burden, one, I believe, I can discern from this distance. When he still lived here in London, hardly a week would pass without us taking a walk, either through the park or along the river. We sometimes got into a debate, usually concerning an obscure literary question, arguments that, perhaps like all arguments, conceal deeper disagreements. I would sometimes, to my regret, for the gesture has always displeased me, tap my forefinger on his chest and let my palm rest there for a fleeting moment, as though to keep whatever it was that I believed I had placed there stable. And I would, once again, take note of the distinct pattern of his ribs, the strange way his bones protruded, as if in constant expectation of an attack. He does not know that I am still here. He thinks I have left, rushed off to the dinner engagement I told him I was already late for. I'm not sure why I lied. Who are you eating with? He asked. No one you know, I replied. He looked at me then as if we had already parted ways and the present was the past, I standing at the shore and he on board the ship sailing into the future. That burden in the chest, I can see, has rolled his shoulders back a little, causing his hips to fall forward so as to compensate and stop him falling at the slightest push, face first. And yet, he does look, from this distance, like a man possessed by action, moving forward, determined to enter his new life. These past years since 2011, since the Libyan revolution and all that had followed it, the countless failures and missed opportunities, the kidnappings and assassinations, the civil war, entire neighborhoods flattened, the rule of militias, changed Hosam. Evidence of this was in his posture, but also in his features, the soft tremble in the hands perceptible each time he brought a cigarette to his mouth, the doubt around the eyes, the cautious climate in them, and a face like a landscape liable to bad weather. Soon after the start of the revolution, he returned home and, perhaps naturally, a distance opened between us. On the rare occasion he visited London, we were easy in one another's company, but less full-hearted somehow. I'm sure he too noticed the shift. Sometimes he stayed with me, sleeping on the sofa in my studio flat, sharing the same room, where we could speak in the dark till one of us fell asleep. Most of the time, though, he got a room at a small hotel in Paddington. We would meet there in the neighborhood arranged around the train station, which fills the surrounding streets with a transitory air, made us both feel like visitors and accentuated the sense that our friendship had become a replica of what it had once been when he lived here and we shared the city the way honest laborers share tools. But now, when he spoke, he often looked away, giving the impression that he was thinking aloud or involved in a conversation with himself. And when I was telling him a story, I would notice myself leaning forward slightly and catch an almost querulous tone in my voice, as though I were trying to convince him of an unlikely proposition. No one is more capable of falsities, nor as requiring of them, than those who wish never to part ways.
So this novel explores the fallout of a 1984 shooting at the Libyan embassy in London and its effect on three friends. A policewoman dies, 11 people are injured, and it's a melange of real-world events and a meditation on friendship. So put us in your mind when you conceived of this novel. What caused you to use this particular setting and this particular constellation of people for this meditation on friendship?
It's very hard to answer. It's always, for me, fascinating where a work starts and to account for it. Of course, the easy answer is the first time you sat down to write it. Well, that first sentence, it is, of course, impossible to be certain of what is contained in anyone's chest, least of all one's own, so on. That I wrote that 8 years before I sat down to write the book. So you could say that's when the book started. But then I found a note from when we lived in Paris in 2002 or 2003, where I wrote on the back of an envelope an idea for a novel, having not written one yet or published one yet. And the idea was about these three male friends who are living in exile in London. And so you could say that's when it started. but also there's an earlier date when a couple of years before that, my wife and I were visiting her family in California, and I had an old friend who somehow had ended up there. And I'd seen him, and he was fine. But in that afternoon, I went home, and I was just so overcome by this sense that so many of the people I know have had to leave for one reason or another. And appeared to me, particularly men of my generation at that moment, appeared to me as sort of scattered here and there, and that they were doing their best, but you lose a lot of your force when you leave home. You know, we all do, you know. So that sensation, I was carrying it with me. So you could say that's when the book started. But then even earlier than that, when I was 13 years old, that was when we were sitting in Cairo with my family. We just had lunch. Somebody had switched on that evil instrument, the TV, and the news came on, and it was the most dramatic news. It was a shooting in front of the Libyan embassy in London, and it only lasted for a few seconds. But I remember seeing these young men balaclavaed because they were all here studying, and they had hoped to go home after this demonstration, this harmless demonstration in front of the Libyan embassy in London in 17th of April 1984. And they were wounded, and they were on the floor, and they were screaming. And one of them in particular really captured my attention because he was screaming and screaming and screaming, and then occasionally he would call for his mother. And I thought I'd misheard it. And then an adult in the room said, one of my uncles, I think he just called for his mother. And, and I tried to forget about it. And then years later, when I came to London and studying and at university, I met people who were shot at that demonstration. So it's sort of in fits and starts. And of course, none of these moments are the whole book, because the book is about so many other things.
So this book has this interesting device where you flip in and out. It's clearly a novel, but you appropriate or make reference to real-world events through the course of the novel. Yeah. The shooting being sort of a critical one. But Hosam, who's one of your key protagonists, who's a writer, has one of his stories, a political allegory encouraging defiance of the Libyan regime, read out over the BBC Arabic World Service. And then an event follows, which in fact happened in the real world, but you've invented a story around that. So firstly, we're going to only do this once more, and this is now. I'd like you to indulge us and read out that announcement that's in the novel.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked me to do that, because when the opening of the book that I read you, Khaled is the narrator, and he's bidding farewell to his friend Hosam, who's going to Paris. From Paris, he's going to immigrate to what Hosam refers to as the ever after, and Khaled calls the place from where people rarely ever return, California, United States. And so it does feel like a final parting, and he's so overcome by it that he decides not to take the bus back to his flat in Shepherd's Bush, but rather walk back. And the whole book is told on that walk. And part of what he's thinking about is he's trying to find the moment when Hosam entered his life. And he actually discovers that the moment Hosam entered his life was before they met, quite a few years before they met, when he heard the story by him that Hosam wrote when he was still at university. And Mustafa, Muhammad Mustafa Ramadan, who was a real person. He's was a BBC Arabic anchor and sort of the voice of our youth, right? And he was also from Benghazi, from Libya. and was assassinated in London by Gaddafi agents. And Muhammad Mustafa Ramadan, of course, never read this story because the story never existed. But I sort of have him do that in the news. So this is Khaled at the age of 15 in Benghazi with his family. Muhammad Mustafa Ramadan announced the title of the story, The Given and the Taken, and began to read. My father started, and sorry, I'm going to stop for a minute to tell you just a little bit. Sorry, this is sort of I'm sort of revealing a bit of the mechanics here, but years ago, wonderful Iraqi poet Fadl al-Sultani told me that he had read a story in Al-Sharq al-Awsat newspaper, which is published out of London, by a Libyan writer about a man who is eaten by his cat. And he said, I just could never forget the story. Do you know it? And I asked everybody I knew about whether they knew this story. And nobody could remember anything like that. So I asked Fadl, who was an editor at the Sharq al-Awsat, to go into the archive and find it. So he went to the archive and came back and said, couldn't find it. So did Fadl read it somewhere else and forget? Who knows? But I also couldn't get the story out of my head. And so this was an opportunity to sort of write the story or write in the voice of somebody else. And through doing that, embody perhaps more intimately this character that I was making up, Hosam.
And while Hisham finds a space, when I read this first, I couldn't get it out of my head. So you're in for a treat.
Muhammad Mustafa Ramadan announced the title of the story, The Given and the Taken, and began to read. My father stared into space, utterly focused. My sister Su'ad occasionally lifted her eyes from the table to look in my direction or at mother or father. Mother kept her eyes on me. Before putting on his socks, the man lay down on his back in the middle of the room and tried to remember where he was meant to be. A cat paced around his body. He felt the moist tip of its nose touch the big toe of his left foot. It began to lick it. It was not an unpleasant sensation. He could feel its rapid breath when the animal started, tenderly, almost affectionately, nibbling on the soft skin. The refinement of modern life, he thought, as he considered how the comforts of cotton socks, shoes, and slippers had made a delicacy of his feet. But then the cat bit into him, puncturing the skin. The sting was sharp and precise, and yet began to recede the moment the cat licked the blood clean. It paused for a moment, and then it purred and rested and purred some more. He felt an unexpected satisfaction at its pleasure. He thought that he too ought to close his eyes a little. When he woke up, there was still the clock-like rhythm of the cat's breathing beside his foot. It licked the sore spot again, then turned to its own paw, bathing it with licks and using its teeth to scrub and nibble it clean. It stood by listlessly, facing his foot, before it dug its teeth once again into his toe and snatched off a piece of flesh. He looked up, and its eyes showed no outrage, no remorse, but stared right back at him. He laid his head down. The pain was unbearable and tremendous, and yet, the man thought, unbearable was not the right word. If anything, it was, surprisingly, bearable. He remained stretched on the floor of his room while the cat worked diligently and calmly. Every time it licked and comforted the wound, it prized away another piece of flesh until it finished the toe. It moved on to the next one. The strange thing was that as the cat ate, the man began to see, as vividly as a film running in front of him, the history of his toes, from their life in the womb to the present day, their adventures and misadventures, which were his own, but rendered in mockingly heroic proportions, so that as he was being eaten, he felt he was also being mourned, albeit sarcastically. This grotesque spectacle of his life became more hypnotic the more the cat continued its diabolical scheme. It worked with unquestionable determination. It ate its way up the man's legs and arms, and he continued to watch and marvel at the life story of his limbs, the memories lost and now caught all at once as though in a net, an elaborate retelling of a modest life. Although the cat's appetite seemed bottomless, particularly for a creature of its size, it did not rush or hurry to satisfy it. And this confidence was, it turned out in the end, its boldest weapon. Now the man was nothing but head and torso. His head, which he concluded was the only thing he truly could not do without, remained perfectly intact. The cat approached slowly, pausing by his left ear, as if about to tell him something of grave importance. Instead, he heard his own voice. Up to this point in the story, Muhammad Mustafa Ramadan read soberly in the dispassionate tone of a news reporter. But now a shallow quiver, like a feather trapped in a tunnel, entered his throat. He paused and repeated the last line. Instead, he heard his own voice. It did not work. He did not manage to rid himself of the emotion. He opened his mouth and said, "No." The word filled the room. It sounded astonishingly clear. He knew he was not speaking for himself alone. The cat lifted its head and departed, leaving the man to finally resume his life. The story was so brief that it could not have taken Muhammad Mustafa Ramadan much more than a minute to read. I was not sure what to make of it. I felt infected by it. For the days and weeks that followed, I tried to push it out of my mind, but it remained always there, in the depths, rising at the most unexpected moments. When I was waiting for the school bus in the dark, at that undecided hour when the day had begun, but dawn was still to break, or when it was my turn to mop the courtyard, excuse me, which lay in the middle of the house like an open secret, naked to the sky, but unexposed to any of the neighbors, so that you could take your clothes off and no one would ever know. I found myself thinking about Hisham Matar's depiction of a defeat that was also a victory. It's that feather. I found myself thinking about Hisham Matar's depiction of a defeat that was also a victory. At such moments, I was unable to ignore the story's claustrophobic atmosphere, manifested so horribly in the man's inexplicable lack of objection, which is rendered all the more upsetting by how effective his protest proves to be when it eventually comes. The story entered my dreams, where I sometimes saw myself as the limbless figure in constant need of looking after. What I remember most from those dreams was the savage sense of my own helplessness. This, together with what happened to Muhammad Mustafa Ramadan shortly after he read the story, frightened me. I became, in silent and private ways, powerfully aware of the fragility of all that I treasured, my family, my very sense of myself, the future I allowed myself to expect. Thank you.
So I want to ask you, based on that, a question about the relationship between literature and politics, something that we've discussed on a number of occasions. But in the Orwell Prizes for 2024 sort of calling out of your book, there are a few words which I wanted to read to you to ask you to reflect on, because it says, the quietness of the prose belies the event's traumatic drama and its profound personal and political repercussions. The style is old-fashioned, genteel almost, and authentic to the point of reading like the most exquisite memoir. A warm and extraordinary clear-sighted novel that is in part about the power of the literary world to affect real-world change. And when I read that account, a more compelling, terrifying account of how authoritarian rule can consume people with their consent, and a more powerful metaphor I can't imagine. And you write that and it sticks. And yet your writing is never didactic. It's never on a political crusade, but it always sits in that liminal space between exposition and something deeply political. And it's a very fine and a hard line to ride. And the worst writing lapses into didacticism, and the other side of that is a sort of agnostic indifference to the world. And you seem to sit perfectly poised in the middle. How do you do that?
It's something I think a lot about, and I mean, to state the obvious, I hope and I'm sure is obvious to everybody in the room, that it is particularly unbearable being Arabic of my generation, because it means that you have had to observe in very intimate ways incredible layers of dispossession, oppression, violence, colonialism. I mean, there's so many things, and also everything that you knew as a child is no longer the case, right? I mean, literally, territories change, places are flattened, things are sliced, and the disruption and the private psychic effect of all of that is very difficult to explain to anyone who hasn't experienced it. It's very difficult to impart it. Today, I don't know why, but at some point around midday, I remembered my dear and sadly now departed friend Khaled, a wonderful Syrian novelist, and talk about a man who had to sort of also navigate this under the most brutal conditions. And I remember Khaled once telling me in his old familiar teasing, but also darkly teasing way, he says, "Oh, you and I were done for. We can't. I mean, can you imagine being one of those European writers and you could just write about frivolity?" He says, "How can you write about frivolity when you know all these people who have been killed or are imprisoned, who disappear? How do you do that when your own people are displaced, dispossessed, killed on such a large scale, and seemingly nothing really happens, nothing changes? What does that..." I don't have an answer, but I think what I have been trying to do is, in a sense, create the right conditions for me to absorb all that is around me. And sometimes even very well-intentioned active positions can be a way to shield you from how it really feels, you know. Sometimes action, of course, as admirable as it is, can also be a way of not listening, of not really perceiving. And as a writer, I am interested in perceiving not only the bad, everything. I want to be open and see what happens. And also, I've discovered that there is something that you only find out by making work. That that word author is slightly ironic. You know, you're not the authority actually over the work. You know, that if you are going to write something that is going to be worthwhile, it's the wrong way of putting it. If you're going to write something that is going to surprise you, it has to lead you. You know, it is the authority, and you are somehow a servant. You're following, you're listening. So all of that is very, very complex, but I think it also, I believe really, it sheds a light on the nature of art itself, and why I often feel that our culture undervalues what happens in our engagement with art, and why pastiche and mediocre work is actually, apart from it being of bad taste, is actually poisonous. I really believe that. Because I think what is really exceptional about art is that in a transactional world where most our engagements, we think, okay, this is what I'm going to get out of it. I'm going to go do this, and I'm going to get this out of it. You know, art is one of those very few, maybe you can argue the last remaining place, apart from nature, God, and love, probably, where there is that doesn't happen. You know, where you go in, you engage with the work, and who knows what's going to happen. It could be, the outcome is not clear, and that sort of promiscuity and freedom and generosity in all the meanings of that word, you know, and being giving, but also being generative, you know, it really belongs to art. That's why I love, there's a sentence, sorry, it's a long answer, I know, but one last thing I would say is that there's a sentence, for me, is one of the most phenomenal, important sentences in the history of literature, I would say, is the question that Shahrazad asks to Shahrayar in the Arabian Nights, right at the beginning of the book, when she says, "Do I have your permission to tell a story?" It's a very strange question, because we all know that it's impossible to answer that, because I don't know what that story is going to do to me, right? How could you give me permission about something that you don't know what's, you know? And as we find out in that book, that has such a huge consequence, because she bends time, she stretches time, she buys time, but she's also engaged in a process of conversion.
So let's go down a little bit of the art conversation a little further, because art features in so many of your works. The Month in Siena is, you know, art is a sort of central protagonist in that book. And by the way, anybody who is interested in Hisham's description of the allegory of good and bad governance, which is in Siena, is a political science essay by way of a description of a piece of art without you knowing it. So I commend that to you. In this book, Khaled goes to the National Gallery and looks at a piece of work by Hans Memling in a way that you do, which is to go to a museum and look at a piece of work for an hour and then leave. That's too short.
No,
Much longer.
An hour is too long. No.
10 minutes. But I'm interested in that reflection of what he gets out of it and you get out of it by looking in this very deep and studied way at one piece of work, and why you put that in the book, but also the broader question of going to a place and looking at one painting.
Well, in that book, there, in that scene in the book, Hosam's girlfriend wants to talk to Khaled about something very important that has occurred in her time with Hosam, and she asks him to meet her at the National Gallery in order to look at this painting that she can't make sense of. What is this boy doing in the painting? What is he thinking about? But for me personally, it really started in when I was 19 years old. It started as a kind of way to manage a problem. And the problem was that I am very interested in art, but I don't know what to do when I go to a museum, and I get very nervous. And there's just, I mean, where do you start? So many things, and a lot of people. The air isn't very good, and you know. So I thought, well, how do I manage this? And I thought I'll choose one painting every week, and I'll go there in my lunch hour. Thankfully, I lived close to it. And I would go in my lunch hour and eat my sandwich in front of a painting, 20 minutes maximum. And I would do that for 1 week, and then the next week switch to another painting. And of course, in hindsight, I can see there was, the coincidence wasn't a pure coincidence, because it was also, that was the time when I lost my father. And I lost my father in a very ambiguous way. He disappeared, and he was kidnapped and disappeared. And now retrospectively, it makes sense perhaps, because in a moment of great inarticulacy, of disappearance, you go to the most articulate, arguably the most articulate things, the most appearing things, right? These paintings. But it has since become a lifelong habit. I don't go every day, you'd be glad to know, but I go once a week, maybe twice a week, it depends. And I'm looking at one painting, and I'm looking at other things too, but it's usually one painting, and it takes, you know, it could take anything from 6 months to 2 or 3 years, depends on the painting. But the reason, I mean, the thing is, I don't know why I do it, apart from the fact that obviously I haven't figured out how to look at a painting. But it is an open question. How do you look at a painting? But also there's this conversation with it, you know, and it's part of what I meant about this incredible power of intentionality around us, you know. And that it complicates that. Art complicates that. And it's just, I mean, it's just also delightful.
Of course.
Yeah.
I want to go to, you've alluded to it, but it's something you grapple with in a lot of your work, and this work is central to it, and an important part is this question of exile. And for those who hadn't read the book, well, there's a moment in which the people who have been shot and the protagonists who've been shot in this in front of the Libyan embassy, it dawns on them that they can't go back, because they're being observed, they've been hidden, they can't even communicate back home. And it seems to me this is one of the most powerful ways you can convey exile, because it happens to them and they then are in exile. They're consigned to exile. And one of the things about exile is you never really know when exile stops and starts. It's a sort of very transitory moment. And I think you capture that sense of its impact on your soul and your psyche in such a rich way in this book. But I wonder if you'd like to talk a little bit more about exile.
Yeah, no, this is one of, I mean, that's why I pointed to that moment when I became so powerfully aware of friends, people I know who have been scattered, because you're so right in that you don't know when it starts. You also don't know when it will end. You are eternally hopeful, you know. So you are involved in a dramatic project of translation, you know. You have to literally translate yourself into another language, translate the place back to you. But also you have to translate all the stuff that isn't language, the mannerisms, your own private ambitions, you know. And you are inventing or improvising this life, but you're also performing, even though you don't think of it that way, performing a self back to the original place. You don't want them to worry about you, or you don't want them to, you know. There's one of the great exilic texts that I love, is when Ovid is exiled to Constance by the Black Sea, and we don't know why he was sent there, except that the only explanation he offers is Carmen et error, a poem and a mistake. But he writes from there. He writes these texts and sends them back, where he's appealing, But he writes this really interesting work, where he sends the work in his place, and he tells the work what to say, what not to say, and of course the work doesn't hold its tongue, But it's, how does it start? Little book, no, I don't begrudge it you. You're off to the city without me. On your way, there's many mistakes here, so don't hold me to it. Little book, no, I don't begrudge it you. You're off to the city without me. On your way then, but penny planed as befits an exile's sad offering in my present state. For you, there will be no slipcase in vermilion, how they used to dress the books. No cedar oiled backing, no white edges to set off your black letters appear for inspection briskly, unkempt. And if, in the throng, you should come upon one who should chance to ask about me, don't say he's well. Say he lives by the grace of the gods. For the rest, remain silent. That's how the book starts. But of course, the book doesn't remain silent. It does convey a lot of things. So the exile is inventing a life in the present, but is also concerned about the past, the place that she might return to, etc. So it's a complex space. Yeah.
In the time remaining for our conversation, I want to now turn to friendship. Yeah. So this book is about friendship. It's about a category of friendship. It's not exclusively about male friendship, but male friendship is a central part of the book's exploration. And male friendship is a very complex thing, because it can be, the hangover, going to LA and, having a boozer.
Really? Is that
I mean, we should try it one day, but
tell us more about that.
It can be testosterone-soaked militarism, or codes of honor and silence, or it can be, slow, soft-simmering homoeroticism. But what this book does, I think, is a really... you say something about nobody can know the distance between friends, or something. You have a metaphor, the distance within friends, and the exploration of what happens in that distance. I'd love you to sort of just unpack what you sought to do, though, because it was beautiful and subtle and uneluctable and hard to capture, but it ran through the book in a way that you kept peeling back layers and layers.
There's a moment, because when Khaled is wounded in front of the embassy, he's wounded with his very intimate friend Mustafa. So that's the trio: Khaled, Mustafa, and Hosam. And they're temperamentally very different. I mean, one of the things that I was interested in the book is human temperament, and how our temperaments lead us to things that aren't necessarily, we didn't get there only because of what we believed, but there was something to do with our tastes, or what I'm calling our temperaments. And their temperaments are different, but they're so close. And Khaled really feels, because of what they've been through together, notwithstanding their differences, that there's no one else that he understands better, and there's no one else that he could be understood by better, And this hallmark of the nature of desire, that desire will be extinguished if you and if I really can get into your head, truly get into your head, it will be over in a sense. But that's the desire for further and further intimacy. So that fascinated me about their friendship. But I see friendship as on that level, I mean, friendship is many things. But it is also a love affair. It is also the desire to really know somebody very well, to be drawn out by them, But unlike the other relationships, unlike blood ties, which are very powerful, and they come with their own codes of loyalty and kinship and so on, that you probably will end up loving people that you might not like, for example, and so on. And with amorous relationships also, even if you are in a very open, experimental relationship, there is still ideas around fidelity and so on. Friendship isn't bound by these things. It's bound by other codes, but not those. And in fact, the best way to ruin a friendship is to say, this is the kind of friends we're going to be, right? In other words, friendship itself is promiscuous. It's a work in progress. It's and it's also very, very difficult to manage. You cannot predict when a friendship gets very deep or suddenly for some mysterious reason wanes, or, you know, it's very, and so I've always just, I mean, anecdotally, I've always been nourished by it. You know, I have very few but incredibly deep male friends, and female friends. And it has been central to me. And I didn't think I was writing a book in praise of friendship, you know, but I think maybe it is in some way, or can be looked at that way. Yeah.
And tell us about...
But I haven't come out, you know, on the other side as this is the great thing about novels, is that you write about a subject, you come out even more bewildered by it than you entered. You know, it's not like I'm an expert on friendship or, yeah.
So
just to make that clear. I was asked when I came in here to answer a question for your lovely media people.
Yeah.
Get your thoughts on friendship. I said, can we change just one word in that question? Art. Thoughts on art. I'll do that.
But can I press you on one aspect of it, which is this is not an exercise in sort of advice columning, for sure not. But it is about the trickiness about how to be better male friends. Because in a way, I think machismo or patriarchy or something has denuded men in some way, some kinds of men, perhaps. And feel free to reject the premise, but of a sort of language, an emotional openness, an ability to be intimate, a tactility, a set of things that men feel are unavailable to them that women, again, stereotypically find more available. And I think I felt in the book this ability to kind of, you felt their friendship, and you felt the depth of it, and you felt that they were proper friends and friends who were the kinds of friends, notwithstanding the complications, that there may be things in that are worth emulating.
Yeah. I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I mean, I recognize what the premise, but I'm not sure. I'm just thinking my own life. I'm just different generations. You know, I've witnessed really passionate, close camaraderie between male friends, you know, throughout my life. So, but I think you're right. I don't know if I have anything to add to it, except maybe just have fun, you know, drink more, eat more. I don't know.
Okay, my final question is this book.
Make marmalade.
This book is a love letter to London in some ways as well. It has a walk through London, and there are so many moments in which I felt you were dropping postcards to yourself in letterboxes that you were picking up on the next block. In ways that were descriptions of the city and the feeling and the scent and the neighborhoods. And it's clearly, you clearly are by and from and through London, even if there's a part of you being in exile. So tell us about London's role in this book.
It's my city, you know, it's the place that I've lived the overwhelming majority of my life, and I lived away from my family. So I had I had to make it my own, and I had to find my shelter and my nourishment in it, the places to hide, the places to find expression and companionship, and it hasn't always been easy. It's London. We can speak about London all night, but one of the things that I find always fascinating is both the thing that one of the things that I love about it is also the thing that I don't love about it, which is that it's tolerant, you know, and you know who wants to be tolerated? You know, you don't want to be tolerated. You want to be, I don't know, you want to be something, you want to be danced with, you want to be loved or folded in somehow. But also, if I'm to be honest, I like that anonymity about London, because I'm also not sure I want to function under an obligation of belonging. So it's a city that strangely, even though it at times frustrates me, fits me very well, you know. My earliest memory, I don't know if I ever told you this, but my earliest memory about London is I came here with my parents. They were meeting friends, and there was all this festivities, and they rented this flat, and I was 10 years old, and we went out walking, and it was a cold day, it was raining, and right in front of Bond Street tube station, 3 men were dancing, and they were totally naked. And they had these punk hairdos. And I remember standing and watching one of them jump up and down and his willy going like this. And I'm thinking, wow, imagine doing that in a city, you know? I just thought, what a city, that's great.
You could be in the London Tourism Board, the litmus test for London. We're going to say a few words just before we end, but I'm going to turn it over to you and give you a chance to ask Hisham a few questions. Please ask questions rather than present us with essays that require reflection. And here we go.
Thank you, Hisham.
Hello.
I wanted to ask you.
Here comes a mic, just because there's an army of people online. So
You talked a little bit about how coming from the Arab region, the feeling of what we've all lived through for so many years. I wondered a little bit if you could speak to how it feels to write that in English rather than Arabic. Because reading it, I was sometimes I loved the book, but I was sometimes trying to read back into especially the conversations between friends. How much of a difference of dynamic was there? Libyan dialect is so rich.
I mean, to state the obvious, I don't know, because I would have to have written it in both languages to know, but you know, my relationship as a writer, my tool is the English language. But that's not to say that I am not aware of the distances that I sometimes have towards it. You know, I mean, something very simple, like my last name in Arabic is made up of 3 letters. In English, it's made up of 5 letters. In Arabic, it's made up of mim, which is very easily translated to m, ta, which you cannot translate because there isn't a letter ta in English, so it becomes t. Okay, it's not too bad. And then reh, which is r, again, easy. So my last name is Matar in English. It's not Matar. My last name is Matar, right? So something as small as that, you know, you're constantly encountering these distances all the time. But I think what it does, one of the things that it does, is that it pulls you deeper, I think, into the nature of language itself, that language itself is involved in translation, that the origin is not in language, that the way that I feel about things is never in language, like all of us. And then we have to find words to, I mean, that's partly why I think it's a great art, literature, because it's bound to fail all the time, but it's such a magnificent failure. You know, it's always trying to reach for the words to describe the things that aren't in words, you know. So bizarrely, when you're writing prose, one of the things that you're really doing is writing silence. You're writing the atmosphere around those words so as to communicate the thing that doesn't exist in words. Yeah. Oh, run out of battery. Spoke too much.
Hi, Hisham. I'm new to Exile, Sudanese, and I found writing to be the only way for me to process that. And I've been thinking a lot about what you've said about human temperament and how it drives choices that are not necessarily held in political or ideological beliefs. And it scared me of my own temperament and what that would be. I guess my question is, how did you come out of this process of writing through exile, through grief, on the other side? And if you have any assurances, but also pointers for someone
I
who's...
don't know if I've come in or out of anything, but and to state the obvious, everything I will say is my own experience. But one of the things that I'm really not trying, at least consciously, to process anything, because that would suggest that I'm using the writing for something, and I don't. It really comes or seems to come out of nowhere. It really does. Of course, it doesn't come out of nowhere. I'm sure, but I feel led by it rather than I am processing something, and also I really think, okay, this is. Maybe it will seem really strange for somebody who has written a memoir and so on. And, I'm really not interested in my life, I really don't think my life is interesting or necessarily more interesting than anyone else. In fact, I'm sure I'll find your life far more interesting, I'm not particularly interested in my family or more interested in them than anybody else, or in my country more than any other place. So I don't write about those things when I have written about them because I necessarily think they are of distinguished importance, or even because they haven't been written about before, so they're underrepresented. Because again, I can't really choose in that sense. And if I was going to choose to write about something that's underrepresented, oh God, can you imagine the things that will be more underrepresented than my story, for example. But the reason they feature, or that I've benefited from them, is that they have been my education, right? They have, and that's really what I'm interested in. I'm interested in this event of being a human being, and that everything that has happened has just educated me a little bit. I'm not saying I'm very well educated about being a human being, but it just, everything I know has been, I learned it through what's happened, what I've read, who I've met, and so on.
Hi, first of all, I want to thank you so much for writing this amazing book. I'm an Iranian journalist and writer, and in last 17 years that I'm in kind of exile, I wrote about many painful and difficult subjects, but I never could write anything about exile. And because it was like opening a wound that no one can see it, and even I myself ignore it. But your book, my friends, was like healing for me. It was it's kind of like a therapy session, a group therapy session between me, Khaled, Hisham, Mustafa, and even you as a writer whom I knew already from Return. I bought Return when it's first published in 2017, I think, but I couldn't finish it. It was so difficult. I couldn't work with you to return to home. It was so painful, and also it was beyond my imagination. As an Iranian trapped under dictatorship, I couldn't, and I put it away. But after Assad falls, I bought it again in English version, and I started with some hope maybe we could return some days. But my question is, as a person who was so many years in exile, how difficult or easy was for you to writing about exile?
Thank you so much. I don't know. I mean, I'm not actually. I'm not even sure about making the case that exile is necessarily harder than not being in exile. I think it's got a particular features, but I think I don't know. I think you need a lot of courage to live a life. I mean, the most ordinary life demands a lot of heroism. You know, people wake up in the middle of the night, and we all do, right? Wonder, where are we? Whether we could cope. And this slow education that life teaches you, that you're going to grow old. People tell you you're going to grow old and you're going to die, but you don't believe it. You don't believe it until you reach a certain age, and then suddenly you start not believing it, but you have a sense of what that might be, And it's a very powerful, slow education that nobody tells you about. The only way you're going to learn it is by living a life. So this companionship, we learn things together, but I think a lot of those things we learn them in solitude in some way. There, in a very hopeful place, I'm giving you a very hopeless answer, but
Thank you very much. That was a fascinating talk. I really enjoyed your book, and I found it very subtle and moving exploration, not necessarily of exile, which I don't have experience of, but immigration. My question is something that's been bugging me as I've been reading the book, is that the central character repeatedly and kind of persistently lies to himself, to his partner, occasionally to his friends. And my question is, what were you trying to convey? What was he trying to convey through that? I found it a little bit mysterious. Thank you.
Thank you. I pause because I have my own doubts about answering for the book, because I think the answer is there, but maybe I'll offer this, that it's very difficult to be in a situation like that, where you're living away from home from a very young age and having to as I said, improvise, a life without indulging in untruths, and not deliberately, often to protect people, to protect your family back home from what's happening. You tell them everything is great. From the people that you meet here, you might not want to disclose the true nature, the horror of what happened, because you don't want them to freak out or pity you or something, So you're constantly sort of navigating all that. And one of the things that you've also put your finger on, something that is, I think, a central preoccupation in the book, which is how do these things affect intimacy? Can you really be close to somebody if they don't know everything about you, or at least the main features of your life? Is one of the binds, I think.
Hi, I wanted to ask you about challenges that you might have faced while writing the book, in the process of overcoming it.
Really? You really want to know?
And something that you might want to share with us. You talked about being led by the vision. Something that you might want to share with us, the process.
It takes a while to write a book. It took 3 years or so to write it. And so, yes, there are ups and downs. I remember a particular moment in the middle of the book where I'd written quite a lot, and I couldn't see my way through something. And but these things happen. But part of this kind of thing that I'm talking about not seeing yourself as that it's about you, or it's is also very important in those moments. Because I used to have a transactional relationship to my writing when I first started out, Have a good day's writing, I'm in a great mood. I go out and have fun. And if a terrible day's writing, I'm miserable. And I thought, how silly that is. It's as if it's about you, or it's there for you. And so now I have I just make sure I sleep well. It's that simple, Sleep well, wake up at a good hour, do a good day's work. If you write well, kiss your hand front and back and give thanks. If you don't write well, say, well, tomorrow's going to be better. It's that simple, really. But that doesn't really answer. You see, it's a very strange, this situation of having to say all this, because when you're actually doing, the truth is when you're doing it, this all, again, makes it sound like I know what I'm doing. Because when you're doing it, you don't really. You're sort of, you're in a practice in some way. And you're just thinking, what is the next sentence? That's what you're thinking. What is the next sentence? And is that sentence true or false? And if it's true, what would be the one after it? It's like that, really.
Your final question.
I don't know if it's a question more or more of an observation, just sharing an experience about reading the book, because I'm also an Iranian journalist. And I've been living in exile for 15 years. I haven't been back. And if it was for me, when this great friend of mine sitting next to me, he read the book and he said, I've read this book and all the time I was thinking about you. And he bought the book and he gave it to me, and I was reading it, and at some point it was so heavy for me because I had to flee the country because of a protest and getting injured and being interrogated, and then I never went back, and then I came to London, and it was all like that. I was like, this is my life. Mm-hmm. And then I was thinking to myself, how authoritarian regimes have this model of ruling your life, and how similar our lives are. I never thought I would have such similarities with a Libyan person in my life. And I was telling a friend who was reading the book that you could just write Iran instead of Libya throughout. And I don't know if you were aware of what you were writing and how it could touch so many people beyond the Arab world.
Well, that's a great compliment. Thank you. Thanks.
I'm going to jump a question onto that by way of ending, which is one of the things that cat's story did, and what you've all alluded to, is that there's, speaking as a South African who was very involved in the anti-apartheid movement, what Hisham describes and what you describe is authoritarianism. What apartheid was brutal, open racism, but it didn't have the sneaky, insidious self-participation of authoritarianism, because in some ways authoritarianism, and you capture it in your work, requires the active consent and collusion continuously of people, and then the moments of defiance. And the lying is also part of it. So this book, you know, when you're in exile and you're having to engage with authoritarians, when you're in the context and you're having to judge the moment that you step over and resist or the moment that you collude, is the cat. It's the cat. And I think that's such a wonderfully powerful, rich, interesting device to describe that condition. And you've witnessed it from a close and from afar, and have described it in such subtle ways that I think it resonates with so many people in the room, which I think is so, and the world, for which we're grateful.
Thank you.
So Hisham is going to sign books, which is a really wonderful thing. The paperback is out. It's not available in our local bookstore, which means it tells you it's selling so well. And I also wanted to say that the Conduit has a book club. And this book is the book in our book club, which is really wonderful and touching. And you told me that today, so I didn't even engineer it. It's just so wonderful. And anybody who wants to join the book club, will you please raise your hand, and just so I know. Yeah.
We launched the Conduit Book Club this past year, and we meet once a month. You can go to the app. Today we put a group that is the Conduit Book Club, so you can join us and come, and it's very friendly and conversational. And this book is our next read, so please buy a copy. And if you have any question, I'm here, and also Mima is here, so you can ask us. Thank you very much, and thank you. It was brilliant.
Thank you.
So, Hisham Matar, thank you so much.